Hello, everybody. I was about to say good morning, but it is now afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this More in Common webinar, all about people's attitudes to their personal finances. We've got a few more people just trickling in, but I am going to get us started because we've got plenty of content to cover, and I want to give everybody time for questions at the end. So welcome. Thank you again for joining me. I'm just going to start sharing my screen and then we will get started. Here we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to this More in Common webinar. My name is Rhiannon. I am one of the researchers here at More in Common. And we're a not-for-profit who conduct lots of think tank style reports, but also lots of public opinion research. So that means a whole bunch of things. That means that we conduct a lot of surveys. It means that we drive up and down the country conducting focus groups, asking lots of different people, lots of different questions about topics, everything from politics to climate to education to immigration. We really do cover it all here at More in Common. But today I am going to be talking to you all about the public's attitudes towards their personal finances. So that is everything from saving and everyday spending to personal investments and what they do with their kind of money that they're saving up for the long term, borrowing, debt, everything like that, people's kind of risk perception, all of that sort of thing we're going to cover in today's webinar. If you have any questions, do please feel free at any point to just drop them in the chat, and then I will kind of come to them at the end in a big chunk, if that's all right. So to give you a little outline of what the next hour is going to look like, I'm going to give you a rundown, firstly, of what we call the 7 segments of Britain. This is More in Common's lens through which we look at Britain. And it is these kind of 7 persona groups. And I will obviously go on to explain kind of what they all are. But there's these 7 persona groups that kind of everyone in the UK fits into one of these 7 personas. So I will talk you through those to start with. Then we will go on to how people feel about their finances generally and a kind of little bit of context. So what the financial situation of each of those 7 segments looks like. Then I will talk to you about how those 7 segments feel about savings, then their personal investments, then their attitudes towards things like borrowing and debt. And then there'll be a kind of a profile at the end where you can sort of get a really good overview and you can think, okay, actually, this is what this segment looks like kind of quite holistically. And then, as I say, there will be time for a Q&A at the end. So I will start by giving you a rundown of the British 7 segments, 7 segments of Britain. Before I start on this, I should say that if you want to find out which one of these segments you fit into, you can go into More in Common's website, and we do have a quiz that it'll take you 3 or 4 minutes, and you can answer kind of about 20 questions, 20 of our what we call golden questions, and you'll be sorted into which one of these segments you are. So if you haven't done that already, please do go and do that after this session. But right now, maybe you can sit and guess which one you think you might be. So these are the names of our 7 segments. I'm going to start from the left on our screen, which is the kind of traditionally what we might think of as the most left-leaning segments, and then kind of move rightwards. So with that in mind, our first segment that I'm going to talk to you about is our progressive activist segment. Now, this is a very, very politically engaged segment. They think a lot about politics, not just here in the UK, but about politics across the world. Their concerns include things like social justice. They think a lot about the climate. They're very, very politically active. So quite a lot of progressive activists will have gone on things like the pro-Palestine marches that happened here in London quite recently. They think a lot, as I say, about kind of climate change, international affairs. They have a strong sense of social justice. That's the values of the progressive activists, and that's how we kind of sort people into these 7 segments here at More in Common. But just sort of demographically speaking, they also tend to be a little bit on the younger side. Quite a lot of them tend to be graduates. Quite a lot of them tend to live in big cities, that sort of thing. Those are our progressive activists. Next up, we have our incrementalist left segment. They're a little bit of a bigger segment, as you can see, kind of population-wise, than the progressive activists. There's about twice as many incrementalist left as there are progressive activists in the UK. Now, the incrementalist left are quite what we might call civically minded. They get involved in stuff in their community. They generally hold kind of left of centre views, but they hold them much less kind of radically than your progressive activists do. So they have an aversion to sort of extreme views, an aversion to conflict. If there's a kind of particularly sort of treacherous situation or a controversial situation, incrementalist left segments might kind of take a little bit of a step back from that and say, I'm not really interested in engaging in that discussion, where progressive activists might kind of step towards that discussion. Incrementalist left tend to be a little bit more sort of tuned out of the day-to-day hum and drum of politics and everything that's going on. They tend to kind of keep sort of within their communities and kind of and stay more sort of focused on that kind of thing. So that is our incrementalist left. Next up, we have our established liberals. Now, as you will come on to see, these are one of our more well-off segments. They're quite prosperous. They're quite confident. The system has generally worked quite well for them. They've most likely gone to university and now they've kind of got quite a well-paying job out of that. So they feel quite secure, they feel quite trusting of institutions, and they kind of feel quite comfortable in their situation. They generally sort of feel quite optimistic about the world. They think that things will get better and that things can get better. They also have quite a strong sense of individual agency. So things can get better and you can make things better for yourself. And also they really approach forming their opinions with quite a sort of information-centric way. So when it comes to elections, for example, you might expect an established Liberal to go through all of the manifestos, line them all up in their constituency, read them all out to themselves and go, okay, I think on balance of all the factors, kind of information driven, I think that this person is going to be the best for this constituency. So they're quite a sort of information driven segment. Moving into the centre ground now, we have this segment that we call the skeptical scrollers. Now, the scrollers is a really, really key part of the name of this segment. They are what we might call a digitally native group. They definitely emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're relatively young, but that skeptical bit is all about where they get their information from. They are quite distrusting of what we call traditional media sources. So whether that's kind of newspapers or traditional news outlets like the BBC, Sky News, that sort of thing. They tend to look to other places to get their sources of information, like influencers, for example. They're quite interested in kind of going elsewhere for where they get information and where they kind of form their opinions. That means that they're quite open-minded about where they might get information from. It can also sometimes mean that they tend to be more susceptible to conspiracy theories than other segments might be. So thinking that the moon landings are faked, for example, is kind of a thing that we can mark out of skeptical scrollers. Then we're starting to come onto the kind of right-hand side of the spectrum. And we start off here with our rooted patriots. Now, as the name would suggest, this is a very sort of patriotic and proud to be British group. But politically speaking, they are actually quite untethered. So they don't necessarily feel party loyalty in the same way that some of the other segments do. They have switched. They are these sort of they are the voters that actually for quite a lot of the last maybe 10 years, our politics has been dictated quite a lot by this swing group of rooted patriots. So they were the 2016 Leave voters in the Brexit referendum. Then they were the 2019 Boris Johnson, get Brexit done, I want to change. Then they were the 2024 Keir Starmer voters who voted for him on a change manifesto and said, yes, I want to kind of change all this again. And now they are kind of feeling a little bit hopeless. They're feeling quite left behind, quite overlooked by political elites, and therefore feeling quite disillusioned with the whole system and feeling as though the system really, really doesn't work for them. It can leave them quite feeling quite pessimistic, but they are also quite what we might call institutionally institutionally interventionist. So certainly on economics, they would quite like the government to step in and make things better for people. But they are socially speaking quite conservative. Then onto our penultimate segment, we have our traditional conservatives. Now, this group are really sort of confident on things like being respectful of authority, being quite traditional in their values, believing in individual responsibility and sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Um, they think that the established norms that society has kind of established over the years have served really well for them. They feel quite comfortable. Demographically speaking, quite a lot of them are retired, they're reasonably well off, and they feel quite small c conservative about both economic issues and social issues. So they would quite like the government to sort of take a little bit more of a markets-based approach when it comes to managing the economy. They kind of think laissez-faire, live and let live, step away, the market's going to do what the market's going to do. And then finally, we have our dissenting disruptors segment. Now, this group feel really, really sort of frustrated with their circumstances. And as a result, they have quite a radical desire for change. They quite like sort of dramatic change right at the top. They want to see strong leaders. They want to see leaders who say it how it is, who aren't afraid to not say things because they might offend people. This group tend to be much more likely to lean into sort of populist ways of thinking. They'd quite like to overhaul the status quo. The phrase that we tend to use at More in Common is kind of burn the system down, burn the institutions down, start again. And they would like politicians to start putting people like them first. They're quite concerned about the impact that things like immigration is having on their communities and that sort of thing. They kind of feel like outsiders. Okay, so that is a very, very brief rundown of our 7 segments and what they tend to look like on their attitudes from everything from economics to kind of social issues. That is broadly what they look like. But what we don't segment people on is their financial attitudes, is their financial circumstances, or how they feel about their own personal finances. And that's why today I wanted to dig into how each of these different persona groups feel about their personal finances. I should also say, yes, just to kind of give you a little bit of wider context for these segments, there are 3 segments which are a little bit bigger. So that's our incrementalist left, our rooted patriots, and our dissenting disruptors. And they make up about 1/5 of the population each, so about 1 in 5. And then our 4 slightly smaller segments are progressive activists, our established liberals, our skeptical scrollers, and our traditional conservatives, the smallest group on 8% of the population. Okay, that is our rundown of the 7 segments. You're going to get a much clearer idea of what they all look like, especially considering their financial attitudes as we go through. You're going to start to kind of build up a really clear picture of who they are and what they might look like. So to start with, I'm going to give you a little bit of kind of financial context about them, about their sort of personal circumstances, and then we're going to get into their attitudes. So, in terms of how comfortable they feel financially, we ask people how well off they feel. And on the left-hand side, in the dark blue, you've got, I'm very financially comfortable. I don't have anything to worry about. And on the right-hand side, you've got that dark red. I can't afford my basic costs. I'm having to go without essentials like food and heating. These are people that are using food banks. And as you can see, the established liberals and the traditional conservatives, their dark blue takes them way over that 50% majority line on the left-hand side. You can see that they are by far the most financially comfortable of all of our segments. They're feeling pretty good. You can actually see on the right-hand side in the established liberals row that 0%, absolutely no established liberals are needing to use things like food banks. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got our dissenting disruptors, that segment who feel really, really unhappy about the way things are and would quite like some radical change. You can see that more than 1/4 of them are struggling to afford their basic costs day to day, week to week. Now, some of this is also reflected in home ownership. Again, you can see that the established liberals and the traditional conservatives, a big majority of them fall into these blue categories. So they either own their home outright or they own their home with a mortgage. You can see that actually a significant majority of traditional conservatives own their home outright. Now, some of that is a demographic product of who traditional conservatives are, because they tend to be retired in a way that established liberals are less likely to be retired and be towards the end of their career, but their financial kind of comfort comes from the fact that they've done quite well out of the system and that they've got quite a well-paying job. Whereas your traditional conservatives, their financial comfort tends to come from is more likely to come from the fact that they are retired and they kind of don't need to work anymore. Um, but also, you can see that despite dissenting disruptors feeling as though they are not particularly well off, you can also see that a majority of them do own their own home, which isn't necessarily, a marker of actually being financially well off, but a majority of them do own their own home. And a significant number of rooted patriots also own their own home. In fact, the only segment who are more likely to be renting than to own their own property are these progressive activists that we see at the top. Now, do you remember when I said that progressive activists tend to be quite young? They tend to be the graduate population. They tend to live in cities. So these are people who are much more likely to be renting flats, trying to get on the graduate jobs market in places like London, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, Bristol. So that's where the segments are, sort of to give you a little bit of context. Now I want to talk about the attitudes of our 7 segments when it comes to saving money and when it comes to specifically their typical savings account that is a kind of interest-bearing savings account. So here we can see on the left-hand side, this is the proportion of each segment who would like to be saving a greater proportion of their income. This assumes their income doesn't change, because obviously we'd all like to be making more money. But the left-hand side is showing you who would like to be saving a greater proportion of their income. The yellow in the middle is showing you the people that are actually pretty happy with the amount that they're saving versus spending. They kind of think, yeah, this is pretty sustainable, this is fine. And then the right-hand side, the dark blue, is those who would like to be spending a greater proportion of their income than they are now. And what you can see from here is that the progressive activists and the dissenting disruptors, a majority of both of those groups, think that they would like to be saving more than they are now. Now, something that both of those two groups have in common is that they are both quite anti-establishment. Both of them think that the status quo isn't working, and they're quite unhappy with how things are at the moment. Progressive activists take a more kind of left-leaning, what we might call a more woke view on who it's not working for, whereas dissenting disruptors tend to feel that they themselves personally have been let down by the system. Now, that's not necessarily the only reason why both of these groups might be feeling that they want to save more. So if they have anti-establishment views, then perhaps they want to be saving more to be able to insulate themselves from any shocks that the establishment is sending their way, or any kind of times that that they feel the establishment is letting them down. These groups have a little bit of that sort of financial buffer. And so they're quite keen to be saving more. So that is one possible explanation for this. Another possible explanation is that progressive activists, as I say, are a little bit younger than, say, the traditional conservatives, who tend to be quite happy with the amount that they're spending and saving. But progressive activists, as they're younger, maybe they're earlier in their careers, maybe they want to be saving more for whether it's buying a house, for retirement, for future children, and we will get on to the reasons why people save. And likewise, for dissenting disruptors, there are many, many reasons why they might be wanting to save more. As I say, traditional conservatives tend to be the most satisfied alongside established liberals with the amount of the kind of balance between spend and save that they're currently experiencing. Now, when it comes to why people are saving and why each of these segments are saving, we asked people about their long-term savings goals. So we said that a lot of people save with a certain goal in mind that they want to spend that money on. If you had to, which of these options down the left would you choose? And there was everything there, from building an emergency fund, growing your long-term wealth, saving for a home. And what we actually found was that a plurality of people, so more people than said anything else, said that they didn't have any long-term financial goals. And they were all kind of reasonably keen to save, and some kind of segments more than others, but they weren't kind of quite sure what it was that they were saving for. Now, straight after I don't have any longer term financial goals, which was selected by about 18% of our respondents, about 18% of the UK population, after that, security tended to take kind of precedent. It's quite a lot of our segments perceive that it is quite an insecure world that they live in, that things are changing all of the time, and being able to build up an emergency fund or kind of grow their long-term wealth, grow that kind of buffer, be able to plan for their retirement, that those are the kind of the main reasons why people are saving up, is to feel a little bit more secure. We also found that interestingly, the least likely people to have these long-term financial goals are baby boomers, people of the kind of older generation. Again, partly because they may well feel I've actually already done my saving. I've done all of the kind of work that I needed to do, and now I'm living in the part of my life that I saved up for, that now that I'm taking out my pension. Um, Interestingly, those who have children, but those children are over 18. So when we speak to parents in focus groups, a lot of them speak about the reasons that they are saving up is to be able to fund their child to go to university, or fund their child buying their first house, or support their child through an apprenticeship, or whatever it is. But parents tend to associate their long-term financial goals with their children. And once those children have grown up, parents are much less likely to have long-term financial goals, possibly because they go, tick, I've done my long-term financial goals. I don't kind of need to be saving up all of this for my children now. Those who say that their main occupation is being a homemaker, whether that's a house husband or a housewife, are less likely to have these long-term financial goals. And also those who own a home outright, which, if you own a home outright, that is often, for many people, that is their long-term financial goal. So once you've achieved that, that kind of that long-term financial goal potentially goes away for some people. Now, we then split this into those 7 segments that I was telling you about. And I recognize right now that this slide is a lot of text and is a lot of numbers. So I'm going to circle for you 4 things that I find really, really interesting on this slide. Thing number 1 is that both progressive activists and rooted patriots I don't have any longer term financial goals at the top, which the general population does. They both have building an emergency fund right at the top of the list of priorities. Now, progressive activists and rooted patriots share what we call a threat perception. They think that the world is getting more dangerous. They think that in the case of rooted patriots, they think that their community is at risk from things like immigration. And progressive activists think that the world is becoming a more unjust place, that they are increasingly at risk of social injustice. And therefore, I think it's really, really interesting that building an emergency fund and feeling secure really rises straight to the top for those 2 groups. The next thing that I wanted to point out to you is our progressive activists and our incrementalist left both having saving for a home kind of rising right up there. These are both groups that are quite likely to be renters, both relatively young groups. So that kind of saving for a home is quite a priority for them. Now, down here with our skeptical scrollers, right in your bottom left, you can see that this is the only segment for which reducing work, retiring early, gaining financial independence sits in their top 5 of reasons for saving. And this is really, really kind of quintessentially skeptical scroller. They are looking for these alternative kind of sources of information, alternative sources of work, not necessarily having to rely on the establishment that they feel so skeptical about. They would quite like to be able to set up their own business or start a company online, start a company via social media. And as a result, this kind of desire for financial independence really rises to the top for skeptical scrollers in a way that it doesn't for the other 6 segments. The final thing that I wanted to highlight to you is the fact that established liberals growing long-term wealth really kind of sits at the top for them there. So for all of the other segments that I haven't already mentioned, not having any long-term financial goals, it kind of sits on the top for them. But for established liberals, it is that growing that long-term wealth because they tend to be kind of middle of their career rather than the traditional conservatives who are kind of well off but at the end of their career. So established liberals are kind of comfortable and set in the now, and they are able to think about kind of that. They're really able to sort of take that future view. Now, there are also barriers that hold people back to savings. And the major one above anything else, and it's already kind of reflected in what we've already seen, is that people don't have enough money left over at the end of the month or the end of the week to be able to put things into their savings. When we ask people, what is the main barrier to you saving more? Nearly half of people say that it's not having enough left over at the end of the month. Now, this is really, really reflexive of a lot of the research that More in Common does. We poll people every single week on what are the three biggest issues that are affecting your country right now. And the cost of living consistently comes in the sort of high 60%, 70% of people saying the biggest issue is the cost of living. And we really, really see that reflected here. We hear it in all of our focus groups. It really is affecting kind of every area of life for people, whether it's the food shop, whether it's household bills, whether it's saving for a home, or whether it's the kind of the simple things that the government have recently been trying to target with their Great British Summer Savings. Just the little things of kind of being able to take your children out to the cinema or take your children to the zoo. It's those kind of people are feeling it sort of across the board. And we really, really see that reflected in our data for this particular webinar. We can see that the cost of living is even more acute for those who would like to be saving more. So a full 2/3 of people who would like to be saving more say that they can't do so because of the amount that their household bills are, and they just can't put any more away. A couple of other things that I think are interesting in here is just that 17% of those who want to be saving more say that stress, anxiety, and not wanting to think about their finances is proving a barrier. Now, once again, I've split this out into our 7 segments, and I'm going to highlight a few things that I think are particularly interesting because I recognise that there's a lot on the screen here. So firstly, in our progressive activists segment, these are these kind of young graduates who are concerned about climate and social justice. We can really see that idea of stress and anxiety and not wanting to think about it, kind of blocking it out, really, really rises kind of towards the top. Now, of course, among the vast majority of our segments, not having enough left over after buying the essentials kind of rises to the top unless you are among our most affluent segments, i.e. our established liberals and our traditional conservatives. So for most people, it is that cost of living. But underneath that, for progressive activists, and indeed for skeptical scrollers, there is this underlying stress and anxiety, quite a lot of which appears to be fueled by their age. So younger people, increasingly online and increasingly feeling quite stressed and quite anxious in general. And a lot of that is now spilling over into their attitudes about their own personal finances and money. The other thing that I think is interesting about these progressive activists is that 19% are saying that it is irregular or unpredictable income that is stopping them from saving more. Now, we hear in the news more and more about graduates and people that have just come out of university really, really struggling to get on the jobs ladder, struggling to make that first kind of reliable paycheck. And perhaps they are working in the service industry, working on 0 hours contracts. And therefore, we really see this unpredictable income as a barrier to younger people and to our progressive activists being able to save more. Now, as I already mentioned, our established liberals and our traditional conservatives, they are the most likely segments to say that actually there are no barriers to me saving as much as I want to. And as we already heard earlier, established liberals and traditional conservatives, generally speaking, are quite happy with the amount that they're saving. And so they don't really kind of feel any barriers to particularly wanting to save more. The last thing that I want to draw your attention to on this slide is in our dissenting disruptors segment. These are the kind of anti-establishment, we need to burn it all down, we need to start again segment that would like quite radical change. 10% of those dissenting disruptors say that they don't trust that their institutions will keep their money safe, and that is stopping them from saving. That's the only segment where that particular reason kind of rises to the top five of reasons. And whether that is because they don't trust the banks or this is still a hangover from the 2008 financial crash, dissenting disruptors, the vast majority of them are kind of that age where they would either have been coming of age or definitely would remember the financial crash. But there is that real distrust in institutions that sits in dissenting disruptors. And that is also bleeding in to their attitudes towards their own personal finances and their own personal savings. Okay, so that was people's personal savings. What we then did was talk to people about their investments. Now, this is when I refer to investments, I refer to your own kind of personal investments, whether that is through apps or through investment banks. But it is kind of, I have got my money and I would like to invest it in X business or Y tracker fund, whatever it is. But this is kind of personal investments that we're talking about here. So we first asked people, are you investing? And on the left-hand side, we have in the dark blue, I regularly invest, I curate my own portfolio, I review it. These are our kind of trading 212ers. They are on it, they are kind of moving money about when they see markets going up and down. And on the right-hand side, in our dark red, I have never even considered investing, never thought about it. And then we have kind of steps between those. So we have people who, in the kind of medium color blue, I invest regularly, but in a pre-made portfolio. Then we have people who have investments but don't kind of monitor them regularly. And then we have people in the pink who have kind of considered investing but haven't actually done so. And what we can see here really clearly is that established liberals, once again, are the top segment when it comes to investing. 27%, so a plurality of established liberals, not only invest, but curate their own portfolios. They are those people on Trading 212 who are kind of moving things really actively and are super duper on it with their investments. A majority of established liberals invest, and a good chunk of those, about half of those, are really, really active investors. Now, a majority of traditional conservatives, who are also relatively well off, also invest, but they tend to take a little bit more of a backseat role. They kind of let their investments do their thing, and then they'll kind of come to them as and when. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have our dissenting disruptors, who are the least likely segment to invest. In fact, 2 in 5 dissenting disruptors have never even thought about the idea of personally investing their own money in something. And even more of our rooted patriots, so these are our kind of swing voters, our red wall voters, who are kind of quite civically minded, but quite concerned about the kind of cultural issues. Nearly half of those rooted patriots have never even considered investing. We also see that a majority of progressive activists and a small majority of incrementalist left have never considered investing. But kind of in terms of investments, it is established liberals and it is traditional conservatives who are right up there. Now, the next thing that we did was we took our sample of, for all of this deck, we used a sample of about 2,000 British adults, so GB adults, and we split them in half entirely randomly. So we had 1,000 over here, 1,000 over here. And we asked 1,000 of those Britons, how do you feel about personal investments? And we asked 1,000 of them, how do you feel about savings accounts? And then we were able to compare how people thought about investments versus how people thought about personal savings accounts. And when we asked them, we said, do you think that this service, so whether that service was investment accounts or personal investments or savings accounts, We said, do you think that this thing is for people like you? And what we found is that people were far, far more likely to say that savings accounts are for people like me than they were to say that about personal investments. Here you can see actually a majority, 52% of people say that savings accounts are definitely for people like me, are this dark blue. And only 1 in 5 say the same thing about personal investments. You can see people feeling, you can kind of see that barrier to personal investments really, really clearly here, where people don't feel as much of a barrier to having a kind of interest-bearing savings account. They really do to putting their own money in investments. And we also split this out then by different segments. So here you can see the blue dots, which all tend to appear on the right-hand side of the screen, are what are a score that we've given people for how much they think that thing is for them. So how much they think savings accounts are for them. And then on what tends to be on the left-hand side in all of the red dots is how much investments tend to be for people like them. And so what you can see here is that established liberals, the blue dot next to established liberals, the savings accounts, the vast, vast majority of established liberals are thinking, yep, absolutely, savings accounts are definitely for people like me. They have been designed with me in mind. But you can also see on the established liberals row, the red dot, which is much further kind of to the right than any other segment's red dot is. So you can see that kind of about 50-ish% of established liberals think, yeah, I think personal investments are kind of for people like me. They're for people who are sort of relatively well off, that kind of thing. But there is a significant gap there, even among established liberals who are the most kind of financially confident and the people who are most likely to invest and the people who kind of feel, yeah, this is kind of my turf, this is my territory. I feel pretty good about my decisions here. There's a really, really big confidence gap for savings accounts versus investments accounts. And that gap only widens for all of the other less confident segments. If you look right down at the bottom for dissenting disruptors, you can see a huge gap between the blue dot and the red dot, where the majority of dissenting disruptors think, yeah, actually, I think that savings accounts are for people like me. Actually, a majority of dissenting disruptors think, no, investing isn't designed for people like me, and they feel this real barrier there. It's the same with progressive activists. So that kind of that perception gap tends to be widest among our dissenting disruptors, our progressive activists, and also our rooted patriots who feel, as I say, really let down by the system. They are our change voters. They are the sort of swing voters that have been deciding the last few elections. They also have a massive gap between how confident they feel in the fact that savings accounts are for them and how confident they feel in the fact that investments are for them. Now I'm going to move on to talk about borrowing and debt. So we asked people what their kind of general debt situation was to start with. So on the left-hand side, we have completely overwhelming debt. Then we have debt that feels like a strain. Then we have debt that feels manageable. And then we have actually, I've got no debt at all. And as is becoming the theme in this webinar, you can see that our established liberals and our traditional conservatives, they don't have any debt, and what debt they do have, they tend to feel quite good about it. So they tend to think, actually, I have debt, but it feels manageable. It's a kind of tool that I use, and that's okay. Now, no majority of any segment actually has debt, although skeptical scrollers are the most likely segment to have debt, and because they sit at about half. But they are also the segment who are most likely to feel that their debt is overwhelming. So 16% of skeptical scrollers are telling us, yeah, I have debt and it feels completely crushing. Whereas a segment like the incrementalist left, who, again, about 50% of them, so very similar to skeptical scrollers, about 50% have debt, but half as many of the incrementalists left feel as though that debt is completely overwhelming. Now, once again, we split our sample into two, as I explained before. But this time we asked half of our sample, which of these statements best reflects your views of debt? How do you feel about debt? And we asked the other half of the sample, how do you feel about borrowing money? Objectively, the same thing, but reworded slightly. And what we were trying to get at here was, is there something about the word debt that kind of makes people uncomfortable, makes people feel as though it's unmanageable? Is there something specifically about the word debt, or actually is it just the act of borrowing money? And you can see on the left-hand side how people responded to debt. And you can see that progressive activists at the top and dissenting disruptors, nearly half of each of those segments said debt is something to be avoided at all costs, definitely not. But on the right-hand side, you can see people's responses to borrowing money. And you can see that actually, rather than it being the progressive activists or the dissenting disruptors who are the most uncomfortable with borrowing money, it moves into the skeptical scrollers and the rooted patriots. So this left-hand side, this idea of progressive activists and dissenting disruptors being quite uncomfortable with debt, you can actually see that progressive activists on the right-hand side are half as likely to be uncomfortable with borrowing money as they are with debt. So for that young graduate class who are living in cities, there is something specifically about debt that they find uncomfortable, which far fewer of them find uncomfortable when it comes to borrowing money. Now, maybe that might be a product of something like the student loan system, which many progressive activists feel is really unfair. Things like Plan 2 student loans, they think that it's a regressive taxation, and therefore this idea of debt isn't something that they view positively. Whereas when it comes to borrowing money, they're able to sort of make that separation a little bit more. However, skeptical scrollers, on the other hand, are the more likely segment to feel uncomfortable when it comes to borrowing money, perhaps because they kind of would like to stand on their own 2 feet and kind of and be independent of the system in that way. Now, a much easier way of mapping this against one another is to show you what percentage of each of the segments think that debt should be avoided at all costs and think that borrowing money should be avoided at all costs. And here you can really see that gap open up with the progressive activists. You can see that they are much more likely to say that debt should be avoided. So that red dot on the right-hand side for progressive activists. And you can see that they are less likely to think that borrowing money should be avoided at all costs. You can see the gaps between those for the other segments are far smaller. Okay, so I'm going to quickly run you through a kind of an overview of everything that we've spoken about over the last 45 minutes. And then for the last 10 minutes, I'm going to open us out to any questions. So, our progressive activists. This is a group that are financially struggling. They are much more likely than any other segment to be renters. They tend to be graduates. That means that they tend to be repaying quite a lot of student loans. They feel quite insecure in their housing, and therefore being able to buy a house is what motivates them to save. But feeling quite anxious and not wanting to kind of deal with their money and look at their money really holds them back from doing that. They are far more comfortable with a savings account than with investments, and there is significant stigma for progressive activists around this idea of debt. Our incrementalist left, they are majority home owning, although far more of the incrementalist left own their home with a mortgage than own their home outright compared to any other segment. They want to save, but for a kind of a wide range of reasons. And the cost of living, as with every segment, is a huge issue for the incrementalist left. Interestingly, actually, the incrementalist left are less likely to be saving towards building an emergency fund, but more likely to say that a lack of a consistent income is what's kind of a barrier for them. I just think that's quite a sort of interesting paradox between those two things of they're not building an emergency fund, but the kind of financial insecurity is what's holding them back. I just think that's kind of interesting. Um, and they have a sort of very high risk perception, along with being sort of quite conflict averse. They have quite a high risk perception, with a majority not feeling comfortable in investing. Established liberals, as I have already said, feeling financially comfortable, feeling home owning, they're feeling happy with the way that they save. This is all kind of in keeping with this idea that established liberals feel quite comfortable with the way that life has turned out for them. They experience fewer barriers to saving than most. And as I said, they really, really kind of curate their own investment portfolios in a way that just no other segment does. And they are the least likely segment to have debt and are a little bit more likely to see debt in a kind of negative way. Skeptical scrollers also often renting. As I say, they are a younger segment on the whole who are quite online, and many of them are struggling financially, possibly even more so than the progressive activists. Lots of them want to be saving, especially towards financial independence, not necessarily towards those kind of bigger goals of things like buying a house, but towards feeling as though they can kind of look after themselves. Once again, anxiety and stress holds them back from dealing with their money, but they are more likely than any other segment to invest in pre-curated portfolios. So not they're kind of going on to trading 2-on-2 and mixing it all around themselves, but if they kind of let's imagine a scenario where they see someone online that says, actually, I think that you should invest in this tracker fund, or I've set up my investments in this kind of way. We can see that that might have a kind of a strong effect on a skeptical scroller. They are the least likely to think that savings accounts are for people like them. They tend to feel, as I say, more sort of skeptical of institutions and institutions' ability to keep their money safe, and they are the most likely to feel in overwhelming debt. Our rooted patriots are not well off, but they are home owning. They want to save more, and partly for those security reasons that I was telling you about kind of feeling like they've got a bit of a buffer against the world. Cost of living, again, top of mind and is feeling like a real barrier to them saving. And they are also the segment least likely to be investing of any segment. But they are more comfortable with debt than they are with this idea of borrowing. The traditional conservatives are, exactly as I've said, more likely to be retired and financially comfortable. You've got about a tenth of traditional conservatives are on only the state pension, but I've missed out. I've missed out a statistic there. My apologies. But anyway, traditional conservatives are much more likely to be relying on their own personal pension than relying on a state pension. They tend to be satisfied with how much they save, and many don't have kind of particularly long-term goals or barriers to saving more. They kind of think, yeah, I'm doing all right with how I am now. A majority of them invest and feel quite comfortable doing so, and traditional conservatives are unlikely to be in debt. And finally, our dissenting disruptors. They are financially struggling, although many of them do own their own home, but a significant number do so with a mortgage. This group is most likely to want to save more, but also the group least likely to have a long-term savings goal. They are also, as I say, this group concerned that institutions won't keep their money safe. Most dissenting disruptors don't invest and think that investing isn't for people like them, in inverted commas. Around half of dissenting disruptors have debt, and nearly half think that it should be avoided at all costs. Okay, that is the end of all of my prepared slides. What